As you probably already understood from the previous video, from our now weekly review with Dr. Dina Lesniansky, we have a war looming with Turkey. For now, it's certainly not in a hot phase. It's more of a verbal, I would say, political and propaganda nature. But overall, it's gradually turning into a war. Proxy. On that side, there is Giuliani with his bandits. On our side, there are Druze and possibly Kurds. In principle, if everything continues to develop as it is now and nothing changes, then in general, it is not far from a direct clash. I suddenly thought that I should probably compare them after all. The Turkish and Israeli armies, that is the power of Turkey and the power of Israel, and try to understand what all this is about. It could in general spill over. Right now we're going to compare, but we won't be comparing the entire Turkish army and the entire Israeli army all at once. We won't do it all at once. We'll break it down into several parts. And it's clear that, for now at least, without having a common border, most likely this confrontation could happen either in the air or at sea. But considering the ways modern warfare is conducted both in the air and at sea. So in this video, to put it simply, we will be comparing the capabilities of the Israeli Air Force and the Turkish Air Force as the most likely players in the future in the conflict, as the most likely forces that could confront each other, including, by the way, in the skies over Syria. Hello everyone, my name is Sergey Auslender. You're on my channel. Please don't forget to support this video. Hit the like button, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel, preferably while you're watching or right after. The YouTube algorithms really love that. You can support the channel financially through the Super Thanks button or the heart with a $sign. There are two platforms, Boosty and Patreon. The links to them are in the description, and you can become a channel sponsor on YouTube. All of this is important and necessary, and a huge thank you to everyone who is doing this. So, as I already said, let's compare the Turkish army, the ground army, and the Israeli army as a whole. The ground forces. We won't be doing that for now because, once again, there's no common border, but it could, by the way, appear. Because Turkey is starting to actively penetrate into Syria and is gradually getting closer to our borders. And very soon the Iranian threat, which we have been fighting for decades in Syria. Since the beginning of the civil war, it could be replaced by the Turkish threat. But that's still a long way off for now. But a confrontation in the air is quite inevitable. As I always like to repeat, the Kurds might ask us for help, or the Druze, and we would start providing air support for them. The Turks, as eternal enemies, natural enemies of the Kurds, could get involved in this. And this is where this confrontation could happen. In the Mediterranean Sea, accordingly, the Turks have a large grouping of the Turkish fleet. We also have naval forces there. A confrontation could happen there, but naval forces. We will compare in the next video, in the next one, which will be dedicated to this topic. For now, let's talk about the Air Force. Basically, if we compare quantitatively the Air Force, and we will now compare strike aircraft and fighters. We won't be comparing the number of transport planes or helicopters there because helicopters from Turkey are unlikely to reach us across the Mediterranean Sea. So we're talking about, in terms of the number of fighters, let's use this term conditionally, so quantitatively plus or minus. Let's compare. We currently have approximately 600 active aircraft in the Air Force, of which roughly half, well around 280, are strike aircraft, let's say combat planes, fighters with strike capabilities such as bombers and interceptors in service. For instance, these include various models and types. Plus or minus, the Turks have about the same. There is some difference there. Some things more, some things less, but the quantity here doesn't really matter in this case. For example, if we compare with Iran, we have exactly the same number of aircraft, but in terms of capabilities, you can't even come close to comparing them. I don't know, it's like a museum park from the 70s and 80s, and we have ultra-modern, cutting-edge air forces with a lot of combat experience. To start with, we can talk about combat experience in general. The Turkish Air Force is considered quite good in terms of its capabilities. They have a decent flight time, meaning over 100 hours a year for their pilots. That's very good, but Israeli Air Force pilots fly twice as much. That is, the average flight time of an Israeli pilot is twice as long as that of a Turkish pilot, while the absolute, most of the time, Israeli pilots spend on combat missions. These include strikes, interceptions, and other tasks like reconnaissance and so on. But overall, this happens in a combat environment, which is much more valuable than just training flights. The Turkish Air Force has some combat experience, but the last time they actually fought, well, really fought was when they applied there's a term for it, combat application. So they applied it. That was in 1974, which was exactly 50 years ago, during the Turkish invasion of Cyprus. There was one very clever operation carried out by the Greeks where they used disinformation and radio tricks to make the Turks bomb their own ships. But that's a separate story. We can talk about that some other time. Right now, we're talking about the fact that the Turkish Air Force last fought 50 years ago, and they are periodically used against the Kurds accordingly. In all these numerous operations in northern Syria against the Kurds in Syrian Kurdistan, there, against the enemy, the Kurd. In this case, there is no air defense at all. If the Israeli Air Force operated in conditions where the enemy had air defense, it was in Syria, it was in Iran, it was even in Hodeidah, by the way, because the Houthis had Iranian-made air defense systems, God knows what. But nevertheless, the Turkish Air Force did not encounter any resistance there. They just bombed. Well, we can credit them with shooting down the Russian Su-24 aircraft over Syria, after which their relations there deteriorated. Then it seems they improved again. But again, at that time, the Turkish F-16 fighter jet shot down the Russian bomber literally in training conditions, meaning they faced no opposition there either. With Israeli planes, everything will be completely different. Now, regarding the qualitative composition, the Turks have the most serious machine. The coolest machine, let's say, is the F-16. F-16s are whether received from America or built in Turkey under American license. There are 270 F-16 aircraft, some of which are training models, and some are outdated. But a decent portion, around 150, have been upgraded to Block 50-52 level. There's this American program called CCIP where they upgraded the older F-16 modifications to relatively modern levels. Overall, this modification essentially involved giving the light fighter F-16 additional strike capabilities. So they expanded the range of weapons it can use, including against ground or surface targets. And on top of that, they tweaked the onboard electronics a bit. They fine-tuned it. By the way, the Turks also have F-4 Phantoms that are still flying today. And even there, they periodically use them somewhere against the Kurds. But the Phantom is a very old aircraft. And you could say it doesn't really have any impact. It's just a flying relic. Israel also has F-16s, and quite a few of them, these are F-16s. Two types. These are the F-16s and the Barak. It's more or less for air-to-air combat. They are intended for both the F-16, and it's called Sufa in Hebrew. Usually they all have Hebrew names. Some indexes, Sufa means storm in Hebrew. So it can engage in air combat and be used against ground targets. They were actively working over Lebanon and over Gaza and in various other places. I believe that these F-16s were also used over Hodeidah. These F-16s were used, in short, about Syria. They worked a lot and so on. It's a good aircraft, fine-tuned to a very high level. And the Block 50-52, which the Turks have, excels in some parameters. In particular, in terms of radar detection range. But no. We'll slightly deviate from the story. In Israel, the Air Force operates as a system, not as a separate aircraft, heroically taking off, some ace flying solo and taking down a bunch of opponents in a dogfight. No, that's not how it works. It is used as a system, from target detection to their destruction. And the pilots actually don't engage in air battles. The pilots are told, there's the enemy, they've been detected at this range, use this missile, fire, and then you leave. That's how it happens. So, as of today, there are 2 countries in the world capable of conducting air operations with the simultaneous use of dozens of aircraft at a great distance from their bases. These are the United States and Israel. No one else in the world can do it like that. NATO, maybe. But NATO is still an alliance of many countries, while Israel is just one, and such a tiny one. In addition to that, the F-16 for the Turks is the most modern, the best plane. A light fighter. Israel has F-16s, but Israel also has F-15s. Out of those, 25 are F-15Is. I stands for Israel. It's the Israeli modification of the F-15. Why do I keep saying that it's the Israeli modification, the Israeli modification? Because we are the only country on the planet that the US allows to make changes to their equipment. So they allow us to add our own systems. Moreover, some of the systems are used by the Israelis themselves. The planes come from the United States basically in a semi-assembled state. I don't know if this applies to the F-35. We'll talk about them separately now. But I know for sure that both the F-16 and the F-15, the Ram, Iku, and the Thunder, they underwent serious modifications in Israel. So they install local systems, identification of friend or foe systems, electronic warfare, their own radars and weapons, their own weapons. We know how to operate from these planes. So indeed, undoubtedly, the F-15 is a heavy air superiority fighter. It was originally created to achieve air superiority. But the F-15 Ram is like a flying aviation complex designed to hit all types of targets. Right down to underground, literally. So from underground to high up in the sky. It can hit anything. There are 25 such planes. And there are about 20 more F-15s of the previous modification, which correspond to the American modification. And like the Russian letter E. Right now, we're talking about purchasing an entire squadron. About 25 F-15 planes will be purchased of the latest modification, an X. American, but again, it will get some kind of the Israeli index, and it will be refined here. It's a really cool plane. So back when they were creating the F-15, we made a separate video about it, if I remember correctly. They built in such potential for modernization that it's been flying for half a century already, and it feels like it will keep flying for just as long. And it continues to be produced. So it's a very, very serious plane. The Turks don't have anything even remotely similar, and they won't have it in the near future. Well, how should I put it? The main thing is that we have it, and they don't even come close. The Turks have the F-35, 50 F-35 planes. We have 2 full squadrons. This is a 5th generation aircraft. As of today, it's the most widely used. And now the delivery of the 3rd squadron has already been paid for. There will be a total of 75 of them. We possess, well, we are actually the only country in the Middle East that has 5th generation aircraft. And we will also have the most widely used fleet, 5th generation aircraft F-35. We also made a separate video about them. You can rewatch it. It describes its capabilities. It's a very serious aircraft that is also capable of managing the actions of other planes in combat. The Turks once wanted to join the F-35 program, but they made a monstrous mistake. They bought the S-300 from the Russians. These air defense systems, the Americans were upset with them for that. They were basically excluded from that program. So the Turks could have F-35s right now, but they don't have them. In Israel, the F-35 is also designated as Adir. It's like mighty or something like that. That's how you could translate it. But again, I don't know exactly how much they were modified here in Israel. I'm sure they changed something in them, but what exactly, I don't know. This, it's a military secret, most likely. We have 50 of these planes, just to reiterate. So in addition to that, there's the pilot training system. For the Turks, it's considered relatively good. In Israel, it's considered one of the best in the world. Our pilot training course lasts 3 years plus an additional year. Internships in the operational squadron. Only after that are they allowed to participate in certain missions. At first it was simple and so on. But again, I want to emphasize the main thing is the system. The topic is how the Air Force operates. We have long-range detection aircraft, that is AWACS, roughly speaking, but we don't have them. That mushroom shape above the radar roof, there are other devices there. There are refueling aircraft. So in principle, Israel can simultaneously deploy, let's say, 150, 200 combat strike planes against the Turks' Air Force. Well, as many as the Turks have, but the combat capabilities are fundamentally incomparable. I'm saying it again, there's really nothing to compare it to. Especially, I want to emphasize again, considering that the Israeli Air Force operates as a system from ground radars to airborne radars, the enemy there has no chances, none at all. When it comes to aircraft armaments, it's worth mentioning that both countries have followed a similar path. Both the Turks and the Israelis have developed their own weapon production, particularly missiles and munitions used with aircraft. In particular, for example, this is the Spice family. It's hard to even understand what it is, right? A cruise missile. It's like a hybrid of a cruise missile and a guided bomb, something along those lines. This is for use against ground targets, basically. In general, again, if we get a little sidetracked, it's important to compare. Consider the capabilities of air defense. In Israel, air defense integrates with the Air Force. So, if the enemy comes in, they fend them off. With the help of air defense, then the Air Force struck back or defended themselves using both air defense and the Air Force. The Turks have a very poor air defense system, actually with ground systems. They have some pretty decent systems installed on Turkish ships, on Turkish frigates, but we will talk about these separately. So they can use them, but it's not enough. You can't cover the entire territory of Turkey with ships because the ships are at sea. And the most, as it were, serious complexes they have are the S-300, the Russian S-300, which they received at some point, but their effectiveness, well, in general, we've seen it in Iran, we've seen it in Syria, we've seen it in the Ukrainian war, and we keep observing this constantly. Yes, they're not against cruise missiles, not against missiles. They can't really do much against operational tactical ATACMS. Sometimes they even miss drones, so in that sense, things are pretty bad. I won't go into too much detail about Israeli air defense here because everyone has seen, whoa, how it defends itself. From the same cruise missiles, from ballistic missiles, 4 air defense layers. From the Iron Dome to the HETS-3 system, they are capable of intercepting ballistic missiles in the exoatmospheric space. Aircraft for them are basically more than just easy targets. But I repeat once again, with such a number of aircraft in the Air Force, with such capabilities, no Turkish aircraft in theory would even be able to fly to such a distance that anti-aircraft missile systems could be used against it. So everything will definitely happen long before entering Israeli airspace. So I'm not discussing Israeli avionics again. That's a whole separate story, the Turks. They can't produce anything like that. But overall, they also tried to develop their own weapon systems like guided bombs and missiles and so on. However, they had problems with missiles designed to target radars, what is called the AGM-88 HARM. We've been getting those for a long time and have learned to make our own analogs as much as the Turks know how to make them. I don't know. They have just learned to use them from their own. These CD blocks, F-16. So basically, to carry out a full-scale operation against air defense suppression. With suppression of enemy air defense. That is suppression, the so-called enemy suppression operation with which all grand air operations generally begin. As for the Turks, to the extent that they can, honestly, I don't know, I'm not sure. Israel conducted such operations back in the early 80s. We can recall the Medvedka 19 operation in Lebanon, where they took out the Syrian air defense in just one day, into pieces completely. In Lebanon, the Syrian, I didn't misspeak, the Syrians in the Bekaa Valley had a huge air defense grouping, which was taken out in just one day, literally into pieces. So in that sense, the Turks are making progress, but once again, the Turks are constantly running into problems. Regarding some embargoes from the United States, unlike Israel, which consistently received these weapons, but at the same time developed its own as well. The most classic story in this sense is, well, a classic example. Specifically, this was when in 2014, Obama imposed an embargo on the supply of Hellfire missiles to Israel as a sort of disciplinary measure. Then that embargo was lifted. But considering that the American president is one person today and another tomorrow and can impose such an embargo at any moment, Israel has developed its own analog of the Hellfire missiles. We are still receiving them from the United States, but if that happens, we have something to replace them with. It's one of the modifications of the Spike missile, which is used from Apache attack helicopters. Well, we're not talking about helicopters today. That's already before the collision, I don't know, of Turkish and Israeli helicopters. It's all, of course, like walking to the moon. Today, we're mainly talking about airplanes. And from the perspective of the weapons used, Israel has a set of, let's say, air-launched ballistic missiles, including those for targeting, well, let's say, surface targets. We'll talk about the Navy separately. Our Navy is much smaller than the Turkish one, but with the support of these, it can really level the playing field. The Air Force can really level the playing field. And the last thing I'll say about the weapons, this is our main missile for air-to-air combat. This is the AMRAAM C7, 120 AMRAAM 120 C7. It's 200, almost 200 kilometers range. There are also our own missiles. There is, in fact, some missile that you can't even find any proper mentions of anywhere in the press. So they've developed their own, but what is its range? They wrote some fantastic things, that it was almost 400 kilometers, but that is unlikely. But even if it's 250, that's more than serious. The Turks had Abraham Santrupani B. So this is the previous one from the 2000s, if I'm not mistaken. Its range is significantly shorter. And the question is not about the missile itself, but about the ability to deploy it. A lot depends on which aircraft it's launched from and how it's used. If it's deployed from an aircraft F-15 with its T-15 IRAM, phased array radar. If it is applied with F-35, these are all completely different things. That is, F-35, using its stealth, low visibility, can get to such a distance that a parasite is guaranteed. Let's say the Turkish F-16 remained unnoticed. That is, in short, in general, in terms of weaponry, Israel currently surpasses Turkey, and quite significantly. Separately, it's probably worth mentioning how things could theoretically develop. It is clear that it is unlikely Turkey will specifically attack Israel. So they'll send up their planes and they'll come to fight us. No, most likely this could happen accidentally, somewhere in the Syrian sky, as I mentioned before. Israeli and Turkish pilots could encounter each other, and the Turks might, for example, launch a missile for Israeli aircraft, for example. The Israelis always have very clear instructions in this regard: countermeasures and immediate threat elimination. The Turkish plane will immediately go down. The Turks will naturally be forced to respond. They'll send more planes, we'll send more planes, and that's how it goes, it just escalates. And in the Syrian sky, the first Israeli-Turkish war will begin. But how will NATO react if a NATO country attacks Israel? Like NATO? How NATO will react to this situation, that a NATO country has attacked Israel, or how the Americans will respond. Honestly, I don't know how the Americans will react in the current configuration of the American administration. I'm honestly at a loss, and in my opinion, it's completely impossible to predict Trump's reaction. But overall, it's worth saying that the relationship between the United States and Israel is currently much better than with Turkey. Turkey's relations there have really soured, especially during the previous administration. So I'm not sure about the Americans. As for NATO, NATO will react in almost no way. Because NATO is a defensive alliance. It was created to avoid war. NATO is already dreaming of someone putting Turkey in its place, because Turkey is really getting in everyone's way with its imperial escapades and outbursts in different directions. So if Israel manages to put a little pressure on Turkey there, NATO will be quite happy about that. It's clear to anyone that it's neither the fourth nor the fifth. NATO's article won't be invoked in this case. They will express concern. That's it. They have a universal tool for that. In Europe, this is expressed for any reason. Concern. It's clear that overall, no one in Turkey, referring to the changeable people in Turkey, of whom there are many, including in the military, wants to go to war with Israel, just as Israel doesn't want to go to war with Turkey either. That's understandable. In the Turkish general staff, there are still plenty of people who remember the good relations with Israel, who remember how they used to buy weapons from Israel. If it weren't for the fact that Israel was buying weapons from Turkey, it was actually the other way around, by the way. Yes, there were normal relations, and they know our capabilities very well. They've been here, seen teachings, seen ours, the Air Force in action. They have seen a lot, and it's clear that they wouldn't even dream in their worst nightmares about where their half-crazy dictator is actually leading them. But he's actually not that crazy. I've mentioned this before. Yes, he's a very cunning fellow. So let's hope that doesn't happen. That our war, if it does happen, will be like this, either through proxy forces or on TV, yes, on the internet. But if it comes down to it, I try to explain to you now what will happen in the end with the Turkish Air Force. We'll talk about the Turkish Navy. In a separate video, we'll make a separate video to be more precise, comparing the Turkish naval forces and accordingly the naval forces of Israel. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to support my videos. Check out the video with Dina Lesnianskaya previously. Today we posted a lot of interesting things there, like in each review the consensus contains. So make sure to check everything out. Thank you and see you all soon. Goodbye.